My name is Michel Boufadel. I'm professor of environmental engineering at NJIT. I work on, most of my career, I work on oil spills. And in 2010, there was the largest oil spill in the history of the US. They called it the BP spill or the Gulf spill that occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. So I went down there with my team, and we had different sites. And then you could see it is like really a beehive. It's a big, complicated operation. And you have, thousands of people, I think 50,000 workers. You have various communities that were impacted. And then I heard that, there is what they call the Federal On-Scene Coordinator. It was Admiral Landry. So that's the person who manages the response to this behemoth oil spill. And so I tried to learn more about the man. Turned out that the man was a woman, and it was Admiral Mary Landry. And that's how it ended. I saw her like from our vantage point. I mean, she is like way up. She's running the whole operation. Last year, I was nominated to serve on the National Academy Committee on Oil Spills. And I had the honor to realize or to serve, knowing that Admiral Landry was or is chairing the committee. So we are now in the committee that she's chairing to deal with oil spills. So when Nancy, was talking to me and she said, "Do you know any speaker, that we can, a keynote speaker for this event?" I forwarded to her the bio of the admiral, and then within maybe 20 minutes, Nancy got back to me. She said, "Oh, she's perfect." Now, if you know Nancy, she doesn't say things lightly. So, but which is really true. I mean, I am in awe of the achievement of Admiral Landry. For a woman to be in an environment, the Coast Guard used to be a lot of boys' club. I know that they made a lot of improvements to rise all the way through the ranks and then to deal with this major crisis. It's not a coincidence. Now, let me just mention some of the things that prepared her, but I want to get back to this issue of coincidence a little bit on. Admiral Landry has a master's in marine science, another master's in management. She also has a national security certificate from Harvard. She took also welding class to understand how things operate on a ship. So definitely, I mean, having lived enough, we see that when people are in certain positions, these are not coincidences. They work for it. So in summary, I would like to repeat it then, as Master Oogway from Kung Fu Panda said, there are no coincidences. People work hard and they achieve. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Admiral Landry.
Thank you so much, and I'm really excited to be here. I've only been here since this morning, and I've already had great conversations with your president, with your provost, with the woman representing Newark, and we've exchanged articles, and I was on a webinar about resilience and AI this week. So I'm here because I'm on what I call we're on an evolutionary journey. I'm on a personal journey as a lifelong learner, but we are all on this evolutionary journey in capacity in our nation to be able to handle events such as this. And I want to just really impress on each one of you in this room. My children, my young adult children, one is a civil engineer and the other one is works for Reebok, and I tell them all the time, it's not 6 degrees of separation, it's 2. And I can find connections. Anytime I'm in a conversation, you will find a way to connect with others. And when this event happened, Michelle mentioned that it was a culmination of years. I was a marine safety professional. I was a Coast Guard officer. I used to inspect ships for U.S. and international regulations. I used to investigate casualties. If the collision happens, when she says it's like turning the ship, I thought that was very appropriate that she used that analogy, because if they don't get the signals right and they turn and they collide, then you have to investigate the casualties. So I'm qualified to do that. These are all certifications you had to get on your journey. And I've also done, as I said, pollution response. But this evolutionary journey we're on, if you follow my path, each of you is on the same journey right now, and you're at a different phase in the journey. Some of you are farther along, some of you might be just starting out. And what I want to encourage each one of you in the room is to just don't underestimate how you fit in. Because you might think what you're doing is not so significant or whatever. It's building blocks. It's all building blocks, and it comes together in events like this. And when I take you through this event, you'll have a better understanding of how each of you could end up in a situation that contributes. The reason I ended up at the White House, if you look at my bio, so I did the Admiral thing and I did the Coast Guard thing, and I thought I was retired to watch my daughter play ice hockey at Brown. She was the captain of the women's ice hockey team. I said, I'm going to be at every game. You're balancing career and family. I go to all my daughter's ice hockey games. I get to the end of the season. I get to the banquet. I get the Superfan Award for going to every game, and then I get asked to come back to the Coast Guard to help build a business unit in crisis response as a senior leader civilian. I say, yes, I love this work. I tell my husband, don't worry, I can fly back and forth from DC. And, you know, this is a great opportunity to really help build from the lessons we learned in this event. Well, you all lived through Sandy. So I end up helping at Sandy, and I'm in the command post at FEMA, and the president is having cabinet level meetings at FEMA, and he is asking me, they are asking me to lead an energy task force, because we had a real issue with energy here. You had your gasoline lines, but you also had ships that were delivering oil, that these facilities were down hard, that, you know, the port was closed. How are we going to reopen? How are we going to get energy to the region? And I said, no, the Department of Energy should lead that group. You know, I've been in crisis before, and but I'll help them. So I ended up on the Energy Task Force. And because of that work and the capacity I had demonstrated through this building blocks of a career, that you do your day-to-day, and then all of a sudden you end up in events like this, and they're crisis response events. Well, because of Sandy, I got asked to go to the White House for a year. I was on loan from the Coast Guard and the job they had brought me back to do. And I was helping with domestic preparedness and crisis response. And in that role at the White House, we were dealing with all sorts of issues, the drought in California and how water is fought over, and the challenges you have with that. We were dealing with the Colorado mudslides. We were dealing with various domestic events. We also looked at climate change and everything. So the point is that every one of you in this room is on a journey. And I never started out thinking I was going to be an admiral in the Coast Guard. Trust me, I thought I was going to stay for 3 years. My family was Army. My cousins were Coast Guard. I thought I'll stay 3 years in the military. And it was 11% female when I started, so it is a little bit of an old boys club. And I had 5 brothers, so that prepared me well for that. But at any rate, I joined thinking I'd go back to grad school or law school. I went in to get management level experience, 2 for $1, and go back to school. And I never left, because I fell in love with the organization and the purposeful mission. So as I'm on this journey and this purposeful mission, when I started in the Coast Guard in 1980, 11% female, and no one at the admiral level, no female at the admiral level to look up to, no role models per se, because we only opened the military to women in 1976. That's when the academies opened women and the enlisted. So the military, we had women serving in the military through wars and everything, but when the war was over, they went back home. So the military only opened up in 1976. So it's 1980. You're kind of, you know, cutting edge of this. The great thing about being here today, and why I'm so excited to be here, and when Michelle asked me to do this, I said I would love to do this, is because I'm going to be on a panel in a few minutes. There are so many more women like Nancy, Stephan, and others who have achieved so much and accomplished so much that now the next generation has people they can look up to. And Michelle and I were talking this morning and said, you know, the beauty of it is you don't have to pick just one and say, that's what I want to do. You have a smorgasbord of types of women who do it differently, and so you can choose which one is my role model, which one fits my personal choices. So whereas I had one woman I could look up to in the beginning, there was a woman senior to me, Vivian Cray, who was the first Coast Guard female aviator, and she flew helicopters and she flew planes and search and rescue missions. And then later on, she ended up helping the first Secretary of Homeland Security do pandemic preparedness. So as they're part of her team, we're down at the CDC doing pandemic preparedness. So you end up in these places you don't think you're going to be. You know, no one would have thought a Coast Guard Marine safety person is going to help CDC with pandemic preparedness and then help them later through Ebola and all these other things. So there's this convergence that happens that's hard to explain in a few-minute speech. But the point is, there are role models for you now who have all different backgrounds, and some are, you know, some do the balanced career and family, some stay single, some, you know, you have many choices. And the great thing is you have more women. Now the military is only still about 14 or 15% women. So what's interesting, and the reason I'm doing Deepwater Horizon with you, you're going to get a twofer with this presentation. Not only are you going to get a presentation about a crisis response that had so many facets to it, that it involved federal, state, local government, it involved private sector businesses, it involved academic institutions, the scientific community. It was global in its scale and scope and who was helping us. But you're also gonna, it just was just a coincidence. You know, I looked at God and said, I'm trying to retire. Why did this happen in my last few years in the Coast Guard? But here I was sitting here, and not only was I sitting here as lead federal on-scene coordinator for this, the Secretary of Homeland Security was a woman, Janet Napolitano, who had been the former governor of Arizona, very accomplished, and here she sits as the first female Secretary of Homeland Security. At the White House, you had Carol Brunner, who was President Obama's climate person. You had Nancy Sutley, who was the lead counsel on environmental quality at the White House. So you had two women there. And then you had the head of NOAA was a woman, Dr. Jane Lubchenco, an extremely accomplished scientist. The head of EPA was a woman, Lisa Jackson, chemical engineer, very accomplished, now working at Apple. You have all these women in these key positions. And I thought to myself, none of us were thinking about, I wasn't counting the women. I was literally, we were way too busy to do that. This Women Leaders in Crisis Response, as I mentioned, all those key leaders in those key positions, each of those people. Oh, and I didn't even mention Marcia McNutt was the head of the National Geospatial Agency. So we were using all the satellite technology, the best technologies we have in the world. When you're in a crisis response like this, we have an amazing capacity in this country, and everything was brought to bear. So if I go to the next slide, I'm going to advance it somehow. Where am I pointing to? There we go. 47,000 people. We had Coast Guard, National Guard, contractors, BP, volunteers. But what's really important to understand is we had all the best technologies. We had people designing engineering innovations on the fly. One of the things that was designed for this would normally take 3 years of R&D and testing, and we did it in about 6 weeks. I mean, there was amazing innovation and capability, and this is where you never know. Michelle was in the environmental unit. I didn't remember him from that because I was kind of busy, but that was a key group that were deciding on really, really key issues of what is the, we were trying to save an ecosystem and a way of life along the Gulf Coast. Not just one endangered species or two threatened species. I've dealt with that before. This was a whole ecosystem at risk. So this was much more grave and serious. And it was a way of life along the Gulf Coast, which was very serious. So when Michelle and others were brought together, and we had all the national labs pulled together for expertise because they had no capping stack designed to stop this, secure this source. And they had to design it on the fly. So I'm telling you, this took the whole capacity of our federal government, state governments, locals, private sector, global, and everybody was pulled together in a crisis. And I had gone through 9/11, And I had been in a command post for the DNC in Boston, and I'm sitting next to watching the airspace management over President Bush's house, and I'm watching the planes refuel in flight, and I'm watching I'm watching all these agencies that bring capacity should we have another 9/11 during the DNC. So I know what we have in our arsenal, if you will, of capabilities in this country. And my point to all of you is you never know how you're going to fit into that arsenal of capability. Don't underestimate what you're doing and how it might fit. Because everybody on the group I'm chairing now for the National Academy of Science, everyone in that room, and they're from all different walks of life. Half are scientists, half are responders, but they're from across the country. Every one of them in the room was involved in Deepwater Horizon. So we pulled the best and the brightest in the capacity of our nation together in a crisis, whether it's Sandy, Katrina, 9/11, or this event. And so you just don't know how you're going to fit in. And trust me, the same people show up a lot of times. I've run into the same people over and over again. Here's the concept of operations. We mentioned NOAA, all these ships, all the stuff that's going on subsea. This is the first time, and as an FOSC, you're making decisions that you're held accountable for. You're signing off for everything. And the final decision, how it works in this triad of structure is under the law, there's a federal on-scene coordinator, there's a state rep, and then there's the responsible party, which was BP. And if we can't come to consensus on a decision, the FOSC trumps. So the final decision rests with you. The buck stops here. Now, did that intimidate me or make me nervous? No. You have years of experience to get to that point. I had about 30 years in by then. And you have a confidence from your environmental unit giving you recommendations, from everything you're pulling from, you have a confidence that when you make that decision, you can defend yourself with your decision. The toughest decision in this was subsea injection of dispersants at the wellhead. It had never been done. So I had the head of EPA, Lisa Jackson. I had the NOAA Scientific Support Coordinator, their teams of people who have worked for years and years, and we were really doing the trade-off decisions and trying to do the analysis of whether or not this was going to be a challenge. And our work at the National Academy now is to examine, was it the right decision? And I said, I'm not uncomfortable if we find out it wasn't or it was, because the science 7 years later tells us the trade-off should be measured differently. That's good. That's fine, because that advances the science going forward. But when we made that decision, as I said, I was very comfortable with the decision I made at the time, with the science I had at the time, with the expertise I had in the room, with the capabilities and everything. You make those decisions. Next thing I want to show you here is this is the government's assisting. So this was a global issue. Energy is global, as you know. And when BP's stock was failing, you may not realize that it's not the big corporate guys that are losing money. They might be, but it also affects the nurses and the teachers in England whose pension funds are tied to this company being successful. And this company also went bankrupt. It's a near-death experience is how they described it. So when the White House negotiated with BP for a $20 billion settlement, an escrow that they had to put on escrow in our account, it stabilized the stock price, it stabilized the country, and the pensioners, these common everyday people in England, because this is British Petroleum, they could rest a little easier that their pension fund wasn't going to be destroyed through this. So, you talk about railing against the energy, and believe me, BP paid dearly for this. When I'm in this crisis response, I need them in the game with me doing the response, because they're paying for it, and they have to answer to the shareholders, and they're paying for all of it. And if they walk, we're paying for it. If they go bankrupt, we're paying for it, because it's going to come from the federal government and the Congress's treasury. Right? That's how it's going to work. So you keep them in the game, you keep them working, but you have a confidence that you have a law by which they will be judged. So this was a $30 billion response, and it ended up being over $60 billion impact to BP. When all was said and done, they pled guilty to criminal negligence, which is a big deal, and I knew we had them pretty early because of that investigative background I was trained in. I had my investigators out there very early, making sure they gathered all the data, and you can prove that there were things they did with safety that they compromised their safety, and this shouldn't have happened. And 11 people died in this event. 11 on that rig died. Now 115 were rescued. Another one in the North Sea, all 126 died. So the lessons you learn and the lessons you apply, 115 rescued themselves and were helped by us and others. But 11 people still died, and this thing should not have happened. And this was the largest spill in U.S. history, but it's the second largest in the world that has taken place in the marine environments. This is a huge event. And as I said, all these countries are chipping in and trying to help solve the problems, whether it's a technology problem. We had every boom manufacturer in the globe was contributing, boom, to this event. We had, the manufacturing, supply chains, all this stuff. It's very complex. But just to make you understand why it's an international event and it affects everybody. And then this is the unity of effort I talked about. That's Dr. Lubchenco up there with the NOAA hat. There's the president. That's the governor of Alabama and the governor of Florida. That's Admiral Allen, who was the National Incident Commander for this. And you just look at the diversity of people in the unity of effort. And this is who it involved. This is, it's Congress, it's the White House, government agencies, the media has a role, responders, NGOs, local and state government, the public. And why I like this slide, and this I got from Chris Reddy, Michelle, you'll appreciate it. It's Chris Reddy's slide, who's another great scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. If you've ever ridden a bike and your chain falls off, and just when you get the chain back on, you keep riding and it falls off again, and you keep riding and it falls off again. Well, that's what this is like. You're managing dynamic tension among all these elements, and you're trying to just pay attention to where the chain link is screwed up, and go over and you try to fix that. So it's a complex navigating act, but we use what's called the incident command system. It's the same system we use for Katrina, for Sandy, for other things, and it's a way of pulling together and having unity of effort across federal, state, local, private sector. How do you bring all these groups together, even volunteers, and get everybody rowing in the same direction, save an ecosystem and a way of life? So that's how we worked it. And then the big thing is, plan ahead of the crisis. And like I said, every one of you, you don't know your journey. You don't know where you're going to be sitting 10 years from now. Did I think this would happen on my lifetime? You just happened to be in the seat. I was the district commander. I was the 8th district commander when this happened. So I had an 26-state region that I was responsible for, and I had the Gulf of Mexico offshore. Any given day, there's 30,000 people working out there on these offshore platforms. So it was my area of responsibility, and I just happened to be there when it happened. So just never underestimate. We were a little nervous when the fire drill went off, like here we go again, but thank God the gods were good to us. So, and then think about that succession plan. And I'm here as part of my succession plan. My succession plan is to impart on all of you how important your work is, how important your journey through life is, and how you become a part of the team. Once you get my presentation, you're part of the team. You're part of the evolutionary journey we're all on. Because I'm telling you, I run into people that I didn't plan to run into again, and you just don't know when you're going to run into each other. So I would really encourage you to continue to get to know each other, bring that full capacity of this room to whatever crisis you may face in the future, and may it not be too difficult. And I want to thank, as I said, I want to thank Nancy, Stefan, and Michelle and others for asking me to be here. I'm going to be here all day because I'm really interested in the topics that you're presenting, and I'm interested in the work you're doing here. And I don't know how it will apply to the journey I'm still on, but it's going to be a great day, and I've already gotten a lot out of it. And it's only 10:45 or whatever time it is right now. It's 10:26, just so you know. All right. So I'm going to bring Michelle's going to come back up, right? We're going to. Great. Thank you.
I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Nancy Jackson. Nancy and I worked on responding to Hurricane Sandy. We with funding from the National Science Foundation.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. My background is in coastal geomorphology, which means that I study beaches and dunes. And I got involved in this because I grew up there. And I had no idea I could actually get paid to do this. But it's been a great experience. There were a few slides, but we'll just, the next one. We're a little out of order. When the loop comes up, these are just slides of Hurricane Sandy here in New Jersey. And one of the things that I recognized as a coastal geomorphologist when I got to New Jersey is that not all beaches and dunes are the same. And I realized that I was working on systems that I really had very little knowledge about as a classical coastal geomorphologists. And I quickly needed to come up to speed in terms of how to be able to understand them better. And I've spent the past 25 years of my career actually trying to understand how to model these systems so that people who live there can generate adaptation plans in order to be able to prevent health and safety threats. It's been a fairly rewarding journey. I wouldn't have imagined it at the beginning. I can say, though, in terms of being a woman in a predominantly male field, that I spend a lot of time doing field work, and I'm usually the only woman on the team. But I never really thought about it in terms of it being hindering my progress. These slides that you can see here, this is Bay Head, New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. You can see that we've been using a whole lot of 20th century ideas in terms of trying to come up with some successful adaptation plans. And I think what we really need to do now is to identify ways of being able to foster sort of connectivity and sort of understanding better the coupling between natural and human processes in these environments in order to, again, sort of avoid some of these things that we have seen here on these slides. So thank you.
And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lucia Rodriguez-Frere. She joined us as assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And what we were fascinated with is her work using naturally occurring microorganisms to break down contaminants.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, all, to be here, and it's a pleasure to be sharing this panel with you. Just briefly, I got involved with this when I was just a little kitten, so it was in 87, 88, and I saw this book that is 80 things that a child can do to save the Earth, and it was talking about climate change, global warming, greenhouse effect, and I found that same book in a store last week, and I bought it for my kid, as she's 2 years old. So, and then I was involved in the Prestige spill in Galicia. I was one of the volunteers that we all cleaned the spill that happened in 2001, I think it was. So, but today I'm just going to focus in what I'm doing so you can understand a little bit about me. So this is what I'm trying to do. I try to understand how the contaminants move from the contaminant source to us, to the people. And in particular, what are the processes that are going to control the fate of these contaminants, and how can I use those same processes that happens in nature to prevent exposure? But while I can talk a lot about the science, I just want to talk about the communities that are involved. I'm coming from the Southwest, from New Mexico, and I was in Arizona, and we're working with Native American communities that are impacted by abandoned mines. And you can imagine there are many different communities that are impacted by different mines, different contaminants, and they have different problems. So we have to communicate with them in an effective way so they can share with us their concerns and how can we help them move forward and remediate the sites. Of course, it has to be very sustainable. They don't have a lot of resources, and we have to do it effectively. One of the examples, that, and this is important because there are more than 20,000 abandoned mines seated in the Bureau of Land Management, and over 50,000 of them that still need to be assessed and restored. And 75% of those mines are in federal and tribal lands. So we have to work with them because they're heavily impacted. One of the mines that I work with is Pueblo de Laguna. They're impacted by an open pit uranium mine. It was the largest in the 60s, and now it's a Superfund site. And in that red circle is where one of the villages is, and that blue square is the Jackpile mine. And this is what we are facing. This is a very complex system. We have water, we have sediments, we have plants, and they want to understand how the uranium might be getting to the community. So one of the things that we found is that where we saw a high concentration of uranium in the water, but more importantly, we see it that is being accumulated in the plants. And some of those plants are used by the communities. So we want to see if we can use that same process that is accumulating uranium to promote fire accumulation, but also we want to prevent the uranium accumulation in plants that are of interest for the community. Similar thing happened in the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, but now the contamination is arsenic. Instead of being just 100 feet away, is 200 miles, and still we see the impact. This is the mine. It was the Homestake mine. We measure concentrations, really elevated arsenic concentrations in the sediments in a creek nearby, but 200 miles downstream in the land, we are seeing still elevated arsenic concentration up to almost 400 milligrams per kilogram of arsenic. That is very, very high. And of course, they're also interested in see how this arsenic might be impacted them. And we are looking at the plants, and we are also looking at how the arsenic from the sediments might be impacted by the local agricultural systems. And finally, I was involved in the emergency response after the Animas River impact by the Golkin mine spill that happened in 2015, but this area was already heavily contaminated but this spill released 3 million gallons of acid mine drainage in the Animas River, and it was finally listed as a Superfund site in September 2016. And what we did is we were able to get there 2 weeks after the spill, and we collected samples, and we are looking at all the way from the Golkin mine spill down to Farmington, where there's a lot of farming of the Navajo Nation, and we're seeing how these metals are, and this Navajo Nation are using the water from the river as irrigation, and we're seeing how this metal might become mobilized by these agricultural processes. And this is what we are doing right now. We're just having some ongoing experiments, and just want to say that I have more details of everything in an exhibitor next door, so if you want to stop by later. But now I'm here. I'm coming from the Southwest, now in New Jersey. These are all the US Superfund sites that are, each of these dots is one Superfund site in the US. And in New Jersey, we have 114 sites, including those that are already remediated. And I have been already contacted by a Native American tribe of New Jersey that they are concerned by the impact of a Superfund site. So I'm still working with them and trying to build my work here. Okay, so thank you.
I wonder if, Admiral, maybe I have a question for you, but maybe you could comment. You incorporated the science in your decision during your response, but for example, we heard from researchers. So how could how could the science coming out from universities, be implemented in a policy?
That's great. So we mentioned that $60 billion fine to BP. Part of that money has gone to probably the most money we've had for research in evaluating what was the impact of the spill, what were the impact of some of the, the use of dispersants is just one example, but, what was the impact on the fisheries, what was the impact on the coastline? There's a tremendous amount of science that's going on over the last 7 years since this event, and it is, it's really important that you continue to advance the science and the things you learn and then apply them to the policy. So that any decisions about dispersants that I had available to me at the time, for instance, was available to me because of all the science and work that had been done leading up to it, all the testing and all the, the use of this chemical has to be approved by the EPA. It has to be on a list that says it's approved. You have to have pre-approval by the region that you can apply it. So all that work of science up to that point is what we used in our decision making. That's why I was confident when I had to stand before the Oil Spill Commission and say, I'm confident in the decision I made. But as scientists, we also have to be, and I'm not a scientist, honestly, I'm an operator, but respecting the scientists that give me the input to make that decision, we have to be willing to examine the decision we made in light of new science. And in examining that decision, we might change our policy or our decision next time, and that's how we get smarter and better. And there's so much capability in the scientific community now for doing these kinds of analysis that I have confidence that we'll continue to make better informed decisions. So the scientists go back to DC to present, whether it's a White House decision or an agency decision, statutory authorities, regulatory authorities. There could be regulations changed based on new science. So you should be integrating the science with all of your decisions going forward. And that's the work Michelle and I are doing now with this committee, is we're examining the decision and the use of dispersants and the science that's been taking place since the last report was done, and how are we going to incorporate that in our recommendations.
Great. If the panelists want to comment, please feel free.
I think one aspect of that also is that there has to be as well some room for flexibility and approach, because often I find at the local level we get entrenched in an idea and then we continue to move forward with that idea, and then the reassessment process seems to be a difficult one for people to sort of sit back and say, is this really what we want to be doing right now?
And I also think that it's important to get.
Yeah, it's working.
We can hear you.
Okay, a very important thing is getting feedback from the communities, because if it's something that we are doing in the lab, but then we're trying to apply it in a real life, and the communities don't agree with it, we are going to have issue implementing the idea that we have initially. So we scientists, we need to work with communities, with the stakeholders, with as the slide that you were putting, that you were presenting, we have to work together so the solutions that we're finding are real applicable and not only something that is a smaller scale.
Right, a great example is that we did the fisheries closures in the Gulf Coast, and they reopened the fisheries based on testing, really extensive testing of the fisheries. But the testing and the standards that are set by the FDA are based on a normal person's consumption of fish. Well, if you took the Vietnamese community in New Hampshire or in New Orleans, they consume fish differently. They eat the whole fish. They don't just eat the certain parts, and they eat it more often. So how do you take specific issues for certain communities that might not fit the national standard and adopt your policy based on who it's going to impact?
So we would like to open the floor for questions on any topic to our speakers. Okay? So.
Hello, thank you. So the Exxon Valdez spill was the defining environmental issue for when I was growing up. Can you maybe give us some insight about how the BP crisis unfolded with current communication technology and social media, because of how quickly BP settled, the fact that the CEO got displaced? None of that seemed to have occurred with the Exxon Valdez.
That's a great question. So guess what? And this relates back to her work in the Prestige. The Exxon Valdez is pre-Oil Pollution Act of 1990. Because of the Exxon Valdez, we created a regulation for oil spill response. And it was a US regulation. And the Europeans thought we were overly aggressive with that regulation. Normally we try to make our US regulations consistent with international regulations because shipping is international and oil business is international. But in this case, we got out on a limb with Open 90. Well, when Prestige happened, the Europeans, and I've even talked to Canadians and others who say, how did you implement your Oil Pollution Act of 1990? Because what it required, what's different Exxon Valdez to Deepwater, is Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which established requirement for drills and planning, using the incident command system, the whole structure of the responsible party and how they're part of that integrated command because they're paying the bill. Exxon, we didn't know what the penalty was going to be, and there was no fund set up. The Oil Pollution Act of 1990 established a fund, so a nickel per barrel, now 8 cents per barrel tax on all the oil that moves through our waters goes into a fund, so that if I have a spill, I've got this. It's got $5 billion now, but I can start acting on a response even before who I know the responsible party is. I can direct resources based on that fund backing me up, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. and I can get the resource going, and then I can figure out who the responsible party is. Or so the law that changed because of Exxon Valdez informed exactly how we did Deepwater Horizon. We used that law. There was a key decision with the White House and all the cabinet level secretaries in the first week, and I was in the room. And Janet Napolitano said, shouldn't we use the Stafford Act, the FEMA Act for crisis, which, if you know how that works, the feds pay some money, the states share the cost, 75-25 split usually. And I looked at her and said, we have the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, the responsible party pays. Why should the U.S. pay anything? This responsible party needs to pay this. And we didn't use the FEMA Act, the Stafford Act. We used OPA 90. Now, I will say that this eclipsed in scale and scope anything that was envisioned in OPA 90. It was so much broader. For instance, mental health is not required under OPA 90, and we had all these people with extreme stress. So BP ponied up $300 million for mental health work based on that. They weren't required by law to do that. They did it as a corporate citizen. And the concern we have now, in all honesty, is BP was extremely generous, I would say, with the funding. $30 billion in response, $30 billion in civil and criminal penalties. The next oil company may not be as generous. So you have the two extremes. You have Exxon Valdez here, where there was no law in place, and we worked it through the courts years later, to the BP oil spill, where they're putting $20 billion up front in an escrow account to guarantee they're not leaving, and they have all this regulation in place for what they're required to do. They went beyond some of the minimum requirements, but the oil companies would look at that and say, were they too generous? Because did it help them in the long run? People were still, bashing them and everything. And we don't know what the next oil company will do. And we also have oil companies that operate that don't have the resources of BP. There are oil companies that are much smaller that are operating out there that they couldn't afford to do what BP did. So it absolutely informed how we acted based on the legislation. And as far as the media engagement, that's a whole new dimension. We're 24/7 media, we're social media. We actually got an award, it was in the New York Times, we were credited with how we integrated social media into the crisis response, because you can take input. We've done search and rescue in Harvey based on people texting us and telling us they need us to pick us up. So there's some great things that have come from the change in media, and there's also some challenges with, as you know, from what we're talking about with things that misinformation that gets out there. Yeah.
Okay. Another question. If you don't mind, say your name.
Sure.
Is it on?
Yeah, it is.
My name is Natalie Augusta-Filion, and I'll be one of the speakers later today. I'm Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Newark, and I'm just curious, and I really appreciate your comments, Mary, about the extent to which the work that you were able to do was so evidence-based and based on the science that sort of underpinned all the decisions. And I'm curious, not only from your perspective, having worked as part of the government for so long, but also from that academic perspective, how we as a culture, as a society of actors and stakeholders can better confront this era of alternate facts and the need to be science-based and have an evidence-driven approach to the work that we do. Thank you.
I think from the standpoint of academia, at least in terms of my own personal work, it is extremely vital for us to get our information out to localities. For us to kind of harbor it in peer-reviewed journal papers, which most people really on the ground do not see, it doesn't translate well at the local level, and it certainly does not afford the sort of population an understanding of what kinds of actions they are taking that can sort of increase their vulnerability, particularly when they're out on barrier islands along the New Jersey coast. The kinds of actions that may be increasing their vulnerability from those that are going to decrease their vulnerability. And the kinds of adaptation that is going to get them so that they're in a more resilient state in the future versus those that would not do that. And we've had success in bringing folks from the local level, the federal level, and the state level together in like 2-day workshops to discuss these issues. And remarkably, policies changed at all of those levels, when people got together and really started talking about it with academics in the room, explaining what some of the things were that were, were going to succeed or not succeed in particular instances.
Can I give an answer that's, I'm going to take you real high level now, because right now I do corporate board work. And I will tell you that I'm a glass half full person, not a glass half empty. And if you have faith in our system of policy and regulation and rule of law and the way this country runs under our Constitution, we go through periods, and we have our ups and downs. So right now, you could say certain things. There's this tension between the one side of climate and the other, and there's tensions going on. But there's ways that you can affect change, and I don't get as discouraged, because even though you might say, have we taken a step back with a change in administration based on undoing certain laws, like the policies that were put in place after that accident for the blowout preventer have just been reversed. Thad Allen's texted me, Mary, did you see this in the New York Times? Yeah, so they reversed it. But I will tell you, the industry may not change what they've done, because they've invested millions of dollars in being ready, and they don't want another incident to happen. So even if the government's not regulating, they may do it themselves. But more importantly, from the corporate governance standpoint, is we were talking on the break, the fire drill break, about the fact that institutional investors are now speaking with their finances to say to companies, if you don't diversify your boards, and if you don't look at sustainability issues, we're not going to invest in you. So the Harvard Endowment or the California Pension Fund, they are talking to companies about the science that's out there. And you have many people doing this from from Facebook and other companies. You have many people working their own way through their own lane, whether it's a local community that affects a policy, whether it's a corporation that affects a policy, whether it's the federal. No matter what, I kind of have a confidence in our system. We are a great country. We are still a testing bed, if you look, 200-some years old. But I have a confidence that the great science that's out there, people are paying attention, and there's different ways you can impact and influence decisions made by companies. So, and it's not just companies, it's governments, it's local community policies. So I kind of am a glass half full, and we might not make as much progress as fast as we'd like, but I still would hope that we're moving, Otherwise, you have what are called focusing events. These are focusing events, and we could have a New Madrid fault. I was thinking about her mind. I'm not a fun soccer mom anymore, but when she's talking about the mines, I'm thinking about the New Madrid fault or a California earthquake, and what would happen if we had a major event like that on this kind of contamination, and how would we deal with it? So that's how my mind works, unfortunately. But those are the kinds of things we're on a continuum, and we can still make progress, and we still are making progress regardless of the debates and the back and forth.
Okay, I have a question to the panel. It's related to climate change. We have sea level rise. Some discussions. There are some talks about retreating. That's one. We know that So for Dr. Jackson, we know that sea level rise impacts the morphology of the shorelines. For Dr. Rodriguez Frere, the idea is that there are many Navy bases that are, say, maybe a mile, they are on the coast, but as the water level rises, they're going to be submerged, which means that these sites that are contaminated, now that, the contaminants could be released. And then, of course, to the Admiral, how could that be, whatever solution occur, how could the federal government intervene, or what would be the position of the federal government? For example, if we decided to say we want to retreat, but then you still have a Navy base, that is. Okay, so I think so.
Yeah, let me give you an example that's really near and dear to all your hearts. So Sandy happens, and I end up at the White House, and the money that was done to rebuild, the federal monies that came based on Sandy, and I think it was about $60 billion. We were in discussions, Army Corps of Engineers, all these other agencies, FEMA. Can we give a resiliency bonus, if you will? Normally, you would replace in kind, and you would rebuild something with this is what it costs, so we're going to give you this much funds. Well, can we add a certain percentage and have them rebuild better and smarter and more resilient? And so there were great discussions. Now, for Navy base, depending on what critical infrastructure is there, if it's an airfield, they're going to let the water come in, the water go out, and they'll put the planes back after. But if there's critical infrastructure, like a power plant or something that powers things, or if there's a good R&D facility that's military R&D, they'll approach it differently. But the good thing was there was discussion about how can they apply. And it's, we don't have enough money to do it all, but it was an incremental, it was a threshold crossing when they were allocating those Stafford Act funds post-Sandy that they actually were building in resilience. And that was the first time that was being done. So that's a difference, and that's progress. It's not enough, but it's progress.
And for Dr. Rodriguez, so if they don't build seawalls and the water gets in, do you think we are prepared to deal with all of these contaminants?
Well, that's actually a very interesting question that I would like to answer. But one of the things that we know in New Jersey, we have all these wetlands, and wetlands are the perfect sink for contaminants. And as he's saying, now as the water level rises, all these wetlands are not going to be just wetlands anymore. And we have all these trapped contaminants. And of course, we can predict that there's going to be some impact on how these contaminants are being retained and how they're going to be transported and where they're going to reach. So that's an area of a study that we have to do. And not only that, most of my work until now has been done in the Southwest. We didn't have much water, and the water that we have in many cases is contaminated. And now we are seeing an increase in really high rain events, so it rains really fast a lot, and we see all these contaminants are transported downstream now only at once. And here we have a lot of water, and also many of it is impacted. So we are also going to see how these changes in climate change is going to impact our communities, not only in the amount of water that we have, but the quality of water that we have.
And again, to be the devil's advocate, why don't we build these seawalls and then get done with these sand beaches? It's a joke. Okay.
I think there's a few reasons why. The thing that we don't recognize about these beaches and dunes is that they do have an ecosystem function. And that to eliminate that is going to begin to sort of raise a little bit of havoc with the coastal ecology. I think the other aspect, though, in terms of the seawall, is that once you start that, you have to keep going. All right, so if you look at one of the things that has been discussed in terms of looking at future sea level rise, and if you recall, after Sandy, the United States called the Dutch because they know how to build dikes, and so, which basically is a seawall. What the government or the engineers are looking at is the idea of actually putting ring levee enclaves around areas of critical importance. I mean, places where. But what's happening in the beaches is that the Corps of Engineers has done such a fine job defending the ocean shoreline that none of that material is reaching the bay side of our barrier islands. And it's happening everywhere. And now what we're seeing is increased flooding and erosion on the backside, which is causing serious flooding problems for people who live there. It's also starting to change ecological issues in those bays as well. And we've done some work out in Fire Island National Seashore where they're trying to deal with this particular issue. And I'll tell you, it's not an easy one to resolve, just based on the history of the way in which we have traditionally managed the coast.
Okay, unfortunately we have to conclude. The boss is looking at me there, so thank you for listening. We also thank the panels. Let's give them. Okay.